It's my freshman year at Northeastern University in Boston, and I'm at a party in a new friend's dorm. I'm talking with a few other girls my age, and one of them mentions how she's having cramps right now. And she's so annoyed because she just wanted to have fun tonight and make out with this guy. And now she feels like shit and she just wants to be in sweatpants. We all start talking about our cramps and how awkward it is to deal with periods when you're sharing a bathroom with like 25 people. Maybe it's the cheap vodka, but I get brave and I say,
I get really, really sick when I get my period. Like throwing up for hours and passing out, and it gets really hard with those bathrooms. Do you guys ever get that?
Two of the girls I'm talking to react with a look that I know very well. Kind of blank looks, a little bit confused, a little bit taken aback, and a little bit pitying. I feel bad for shifting the vibe from fun, collective complaining and bonding. And I'm about to change the subject when one girl's face lights up and she says,
"Oh my God, me too."
Wait, what? I say,
"You throw up too?"
She says,
"Yeah, it hurts so bad I can't get out of bed. I just roll around moaning, and then the pooping starts, and then the throwing up."
The other girls kind of drift away. They're probably weirded out by how happy we seem to be about all this gross stuff that happens to us. But it feels incredible to have someone to talk to about this. I feel giddy. Now that I know I'm not the only one, I suddenly realize how lonely it's been, how scared I've been, how in the dark. Neither of us knows why we're in so much pain, but at least we're not alone anymore. And that makes it a lot less scary. This little micro experience led to me talking to more people about my cramps and asking people about their cramps, which was sometimes awkward. But I did end up having a lot more of those giddy moments of recognition, these joyful connections of like, you too? Oh my God! These people who could understand a part of my experience that nobody else could. The more people I found who also experienced cramps this bad, the less sense it made that my doctors hadn't seemed to know anything about it. I wasn't some medical mystery. There were a lot of us having severe dysmenorrhea. I started to wonder how many of us were there, and why was it so hard to find the answer to that question?
What's happening to your body? We don't know because we never really studied the female body. Say it's all in my head, but the research is quite spotty. No, we've never really studied the female body. I go to the doctor to get dismissed. Try losing weight, you're just anxious. That's fine, that's cool, I'm not pissed. Just wait 10 years for a diagnosis. Psychosomatic, you're so dramatic. Hysterical, emotional, hormonal, erratic. Heart disease, chronic fatigue, depression and anxiety. Do you have pain? No, you don't, because we've never really studied the female body.
I'm Kate Downey, and this is Cramped, where I search for answers to questions about my period pain, and then try to understand why those answers are so hard to find. It was so amazing to finally meet other people who experienced death cramps and be able to talk to them about it. But when I was remembering this as the first time I really talked to someone else about it, I realized something weird. My younger sister also gets death cramps. Now that we're adults, we talk about it all the time. We send each other voice notes after particularly bad ones. We trade tips and tricks, things we've tried, new developments, stuff like that. But I don't remember talking with her about it before we were both adults. I had felt so alone dealing with this in my teens and early 20s, when someone in my own family was also experiencing the same thing. So before we even get into answering the question of how many of us get severe dysmenorrhea, I want to figure out why me and my sister didn't talk about this. Introduce yourself.
I'm Maeve. I'm Kate's sister, and I have lived in Thailand for the last 10 years, mostly teaching at international schools, and I'm training to be a somatic therapist. So yeah, that intersection between the mind and the body is where I've gotten obsessed with.
And do you get painful periods?
Yes, I do. Mine, I would say, aren't as consistent as yours. I can go a couple months without having a big episode, but it's hard to tell what it would be without painkillers because I do the same thing you do, which is like preventatively take them unless I'm feeling really brave. Like once in a while, I've been like, all right, let's see what happens. And sometimes that goes really poorly and sometimes it's actually okay. So it's hard to tell, but definitely, yes, same as you, like started when I was maybe 14, 15 with those throwing up, passing out, people thinking I was on drugs in high school deal.
Yep. Do you remember me having death cramps before you got your period when I would come home early from school and be throwing up?
I don't remember it at all. And I don't even remember talking about it with you, me, and Mom.
When you first got your period, were you afraid you were going to get death cramps like me?
I don't think so. Yeah, I never remember about having a specific conversation. My clear memories is of it like happening in high school, being in the bathroom, about to throw up and starting to feel really dizzy, going to the nurse, her saying, okay, you should go home, trying to drive home. So I must have been like at least 16 at this point.
Wow.
Trying to drive home, getting like 5 minutes down the road, and then being in so much pain I couldn't drive anymore. So pulling over, going in the back seat of the car and just like laying down in the fetal position and then waiting for Mom to come pick me up. And then she came and got me. I went home, let the cramps like play out like they do for 2 hours, and then woke up and was like, oh, I have a soccer game today. Great. I'm in time. I can go play now.
Wow.
And yeah, I just remember being like, this sucks, but nobody seems to be making a big deal about it. So I guess it just is what it is.
I'm glad to hear that you weren't watching, because you were pretty anxious when you were a kid.
Yeah.
And I am glad that you weren't watching me go through this thing and being like, is this what being a woman is? Like, is this going to happen to me? But I'm also surprised because does our family shy away from talking about weird or taboo topics?
No, definitely not. I'm surprised that we like didn't have weekly family meetings about everyone's menstrual schedules.
Right.
And it's weird that I haven't thought about that until now. I guess we didn't overlap that much in the time that we were both having periods.
I was thinking that because I got my period at 14, I think. And if you also got your period around 14, I'm 4.5 years older than you. So I maybe was even out of the house before you got your first period. I'm not even sure.
Yeah. And that would make more sense because it's not going to even be on my radar to think about that sort of thing. And maybe it was purposeful. Like maybe Mom didn't talk about it with me around because I was so anxious already. And she was like, let's not add this into the equation.
Yeah. If it was strategic, probably a good call. At what point did we realize we both got death cramps?
I don't know. I don't really remember until the last couple of years of like really discussing it and being like, what's your strategy? What do you do?
Yeah, it does feel very recent. For something that has affected my life so much, it's really hard to remember specific details about who I talked to, what was going on.
Do you think that's just a survival mechanism or part of the idea that you were just like, there's no option, there's no like thing that can be done to improve it, so I'm just going to deal with it?
Yeah, I think it was scary and it was totally out of control. It was a thing that was happening to me. And so I didn't want to think about it when it wasn't actively happening to me. Like I wanted to live a normal life like a person that didn't have this randomly happen to them once a month. And then almost like it surprises you every time it happens. It's like every month you're like, maybe it just won't happen. And then sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't. And the fact that all the doctors I was seeing were kind of just like, yeah, this is normal. So I almost thought maybe this kind of thing happens to everybody and I'm just not good at handling it. And so I don't want to talk about that because maybe I'm doing it wrong. You did go to a doctor for the death cramps pretty soon after they started happening, right?
Yeah. And so they just said, put you on birth control. And I remember it definitely helped the frequency of them. If they did happen, they were just as painful. But I would say it was like maybe 1 in every 4 for me. Whereas before, it could have been every time if I wasn't like religious about ibuprofen. But then when I came off of it 10 years later, it was like the floodgates were open and it was way worse than it had been before.
Did you talk to people about it?
No, not really.
Because you did soccer. You were like close and physical with a lot of people. I'm surprised you didn't talk more to people about it.
Yeah, I'm surprised too. Maybe it's one of those things like, yeah, looking back in hindsight, it's easy to be like, why didn't we talk more about it? And why didn't we share more?
Yeah. It also makes me sad that we're both experiencing this and we're sisters and we weren't talking about it to each other. We could have been. And we weren't.
It is strange that we weren't a resource for each other. I think part of it might have been like my response was to go to Mom and to be like, what the fuck is happening? And she was very supportive.
Right.
She never downplayed it. But she also was like, that's never happened to me, so I don't know. And I think in that situation, when you are a teenage girl and you're like, mom has a period, she'll know everything. She'll have the answer. She's been doing this for 30 years. And then she's like, I don't know. It was kind of like, oh, all right, well, I guess it's weird then.
Yeah, that was like, oh, something not normal is happening to me.
Yeah.
That's wild.
And again, not her fault at all.
Right.
I don't know if it might have been because you were out of the house already. It didn't occur to me, I guess, to ask you about it.
I know a huge question I had when I was a teenager dealing with this was how many people are out there dealing with this? Did you ever have that feeling of just like, how many of us are there?
I do remember in freshman year of college, my roommate also got really pretty severe cramps. So I do remember then being like, oh, okay, it does exist out there. And I remember her and I talking about it. But when you have two people talking about it that neither of them have any real tools or resources, it was like, it doesn't really move forward.
Blind leading the blind.
Yeah, like it was really nice being like, oh my God, it happens to you too. And she didn't have it maybe to the extreme, like she never threw up or passed out, but she was like, you know, in bed with the lights off, like she would get really bad migraines.
Ooh.
And so just seeing her and being able to support each other and of like bringing her food, and she would make sure I had ibuprofen and that sort of thing. That was really nice. And that was sweet. But yeah, neither of us had information, like real information or like a real path forward or even like a desire to change it or knowledge that we could change it. It was kind of just like, this is our lot in life, so let's just help each other out.
It's beautiful and also sad.
Sad, yeah.
Every new person I met, I would talk to about this who also experienced it would also make me really angry. If I'm not the only one, why don't doctors know about this? If there are clearly enough of us that I'm randomly meeting people who also experience this, it seems like something a gynecologist should know about and have a solution for.
Yeah, definitely.
Would you be interested in finding out how many of us there are?
Yes.
Okay, great. The question, how many people suffer from severe dysmenorrhea, seemed like a question I could get answered through a medical paper. And, in fact, I found a medical paper called The Prevalence and Risk Factors of Dysmenorrhea in the Epidemiologic Review. It's a publication out of Johns Hopkins. The prevalence of dysmenorrhea is exactly what I wanted. How many people have it? What I was looking for was a number. A percentage. This amount of menstruating people experience severe dysmenorrhea. The stats I found were more confusing. When it comes to straight-up dysmenorrhea, which just means any form of pain during menstruation, this paper said that between 16 and 91% of people with uteruses experience any kind of pain during their period, and that between 2 and 29% of menstruating people experience, quote, severe pain that limits daily activities. So between 2 and 29% experience what I would call severe dysmenorrhea. Between 2 and 29% seems crazy in terms of a statistic. That's a range that is basically meaningless. I did some quick back-of-the-napkin calculations, and 2% of menstruating people is around 36 million worldwide, and 29% is around 522 million worldwide. Those are very different numbers. Clearly, something is making this data bad. But I don't know enough about statistics and how this data is gathered to understand why the data is bad. Because I'll tell you what, I know whether I am experiencing severe dysmenorrhea, and I could tell you in a very binary way, yes or no, if I am experiencing it. So the fact that we don't have a more exact number on this, I don't understand. So I turned to my friend Andrea Jones-Rooy, a data scientist and former professor at NYU. I texted Andrea the way I always text them. A link to a scientific paper, followed by several questions in all caps like, why is this range so massive? Why data so bad? Whose fault is this?
Yes. So first of all, I want to encourage anyone listening. I literally welcome no message with more open arms and enthusiasm than a data emergency. So you're right. Not only is this range massive, the 2 to 29% is a tremendous amount of variation, right? It's not at all obvious what severe means. So then I went back to the studies that you sent me, and then I looked up a few others similar to it that are basically attempts at meta-studies.
So a meta-study is just studying other studies, combining the data, doing all the work to clean up the data, make sure it's okay to put it all together.
Right.
And then know something bigger by combining all of these studies, right?
Well, that was exactly right. So generally speaking, meta-studies are great. They're not perfect, but they're a great place to start. I did check other meta-studies. The one you found was actually the most comprehensive one and the most recent. And I've read a lot of meta-studies, not to brag, and I make a living talking about bad data and telling people why their data is bad. And I have never seen worse data in my life.
Why am I not shocked?
Congratulations.
We're going to take a quick ad break and be right back.
Cause we never really studied the female body.
Welcome back. We're talking to data scientist Andrea Jones-Rooy about why it's so hard to answer the question, how many people experience severe dysmenorrhea? I asked Andrea, what does it mean when you say the data is bad? And how can I recognize good and bad data when I see it? They told me there are 4 reasons data might be bad. But first, before you even look for what might be wrong with the data,
you need documentation for where this data came from, for whatever study you're looking at. And if you're reading about a study, most of us encounter it, myself included, most studies I read about first because some news outlet or some social media has picked it up, and therefore the Washington Post is putting it in front of my face. Click on the study wherever it is. And if the news article or the social media post is not linking to the original study, ignore everything else. Don't read it. Don't read it. So go to the original study. A great tragedy of much of science is a lot of it is behind paywalls. But even then, you can get pretty far because you can often preview the graphics and you can look at the abstract. And at least the abstract should say something about the methods. If that documentation is not there, throw it away. Never look at it again. Do not. So that's the don't pass go meta. Now there's 4 things you want to look for. And they go from easiest to spot to most existential crisis inducing to spot. Okay. And I think this topic lives mostly in the 4th, in the most existential, and we can go down.
Of course
one.
it does.
Of course it does.
Yeah.
So the first one is random errors. Random errors are errors that cancel out over time. And so a lot of times we don't really care about those. I'm a doctor and I'm taking someone's pulse and I miss the pulse while I'm counting. And so the pulse is a little bit off. It's generally speaking, anytime we're turning the world into a number, we're going to mess up a little bit. And as long as it's not systematic, we don't really care. I think that's the least of our problems in this world. I'd be lucky to have data with random errors at this point
right.
in the world of this research.
Okay, I'm going to sum up the next one because Andrea knows so much about this and I'm a hopeless nerd. So we ended up talking about errors and biases for about 30 minutes, and I don't think you want to hear that. After random errors, the second and more serious reason data might be bad is systemic errors. These are situations where the data that gets recorded is consistently wrong for some reason. The reason is usually some kind of bias, like selection bias, response bias, social desirability bias. For example, we might get a stat like 2 to 29% because there are different pressures acting on people in different cultures and social situations. In some places, women might feel more comfortable reporting their period pain, and in other places, they might downplay it or underreport it. Or the people writing down the data might have biases that affect what data points get recorded.
So the third problem is an error of validity. Errors of validity come up when we think we're measuring one thing, but we're actually measuring something else. The example I like to use for this is when we make students take the SAT or the GRE, the idea is that we're testing their preparedness for college or for grad school, or we're testing how likely they are to succeed. It turns out there's very little evidence that we're testing for any of those things. We're mostly testing, did you have access to some school or tutoring or resources that taught you how to prepare for this particular type of test? So in this case, I gave a lot of thought to, is there an error of validity here? And I think there is. We haven't really defined what period pain dysmenorrhea is. So an error of validity in this sense is we think we're measuring period pain, dysmenorrhea, but we may not be. And so if we are running a study and we say, do you experience pain with menstruation, for example, what do we mean by pain? What do we mean even menstruation? Do you mean the moment where there's blood? Do you mean the lead up? Do you mean actually the entire month? Because a lot of people experience pain around ovulation. And we just really aren't defining our terms. I don't think the error of validity is the biggest problem in this area of research, but I did get the sense from the studies that I looked at that we were not necessarily even codifying this in the same way. And so far, by the way, we're only talking about data on the pain, never mind data on what causes it or what helps it, which is its own mess.
I thought the data on the pain, at least, would be easier to get and find because you know when you're in pain or not. But it's not.
Right. You're not always asked, and you're not always in a place where it's safe to share. You're not always in a position where you know that it's an amount of pain that's not, heavy air quotes, normal, whatever that is. Maybe none of us should be experiencing this.
Well, literally, the word dysmenorrhea means abnormal monthly bleeding. In the name dysmenorrhea, it means abnormal, and yet 92% of people are experiencing it. Of course, we don't know what normal is in this situation.
Right. So this brings us to the fourth and most impossible to think about, but I think the most important reason that we might have bad data. And this is so hard to spot because what you're looking for in this case is a lack of a study. I have lived my life with a uterus for a very long time. I study data for a living. It wasn't until you texted me and said, hey, why is the data on this so terrible, that I was like, wow, I was shocked. And so this is an error of exclusion. And this is where we don't have any data, or we have very little data on something, or we've done very little research on something because we either have no interest, we have no sense that it's important, we have no financial incentives or resources to do it, or it's simply very hard to measure. All four of those cause each other. And this is always hard to talk about. We're in a world that is obsessed with AI and data's everywhere and there's data lakes. So many things that we care about and that affect us, we do not have data on. The kind of classic medical example is HIV/AIDS in the 80s and even the 90s, right? Where it was happening, people are dying, and there was not enough interest. There was not government support. There were no financial incentives. There were no resources. And with HIV/AIDS, lo and behold, the political will is pushed by activists.
Yeah.
And we get resources, and now it's, generally speaking, a much more manageable degree. And people don't die from it in the way that they did decades ago. The existence of data, and particularly the existence of quality data on something, is a direct representative of how much we as a society care about that thing.
That's our answer to why this data is bad. Probably some errors of validity where we're not defining what we're measuring very clearly, but mostly it's a lack of study, a lack of high-quality information. I went into this conversation with my sister to talk about the lack of high-quality communication about our cramps in our teen years. So I was curious what she'd think about this lack of information.
I think the last line that she said of data being a direct representation of how much people care about something.
Yeah.
Wow. I think I usually think of data as this very cold, logical, analytical. It's just data and there's no like emotional ties to it. Yeah, of course, there's not going to be data about something that no one's invested in or nobody wants to talk about or it's not part of the conversation of society.
Yeah.
It makes so much sense. I was a biochemistry major, so I did a whole science background, learning a lot about scientific research and how it's conducted. And the year before I came to Thailand, I was doing a lot of lab tech work and research with one of the professors and starting to understand how underrepresented women are.
Yeah.
Is crazy. Once you actually realize that, oh, all of the health information we're given like doesn't actually apply to women is wild.
Yeah, man.
And every time like I learned it, I think that was maybe like senior year of college when I started going down those rabbit holes of what the fuck?
What the fuck indeed. Why does the data suck? Why are women missing from medical data? Medical research happens in many different ways. Generally, it starts with a specific question a researcher wants answered, or a drug for a specific purpose that needs to be tested. Depending on the research or the stage of drug development and clinical testing, the experiments and testing involve animal cells, animals, human cells, or humans. When it comes to human trials, there's a clear reason women are missing from the data. In the 50s and 60s, a sedative called thalidomide was developed in Germany by a bunch of Nazi war criminals. I'm serious. A bunch of Nazi war criminals had escaped prosecution and hired each other at a German drug company and created thalidomide. Thalidomide was prescribed as an anti-anxiety, a sleep aid, and a medication for morning sickness without ever having been tested for use in pregnant people. And it turns out thalidomide caused extreme birth defects. Over 10,000 babies born in 46 countries were affected. Even though the FDA didn't approve thalidomide for use in the US, about 20,000 US patients took the drug. People were outraged and rightly concerned that not enough was known about how new drugs could affect fetuses. There was a lot of pressure on the FDA to do something to prevent this from happening ever again. Because, that's what the FDA was created to do. What the FDA did was create a policy that excluded women, quote, of reproductive potential from clinical trials. So despite the fact that the FDA had never even approved thalidomide for use in the US, and despite the fact that thalidomide had never been tested on pregnant people, just prescribed to them after it was approved, thalidomide was the reason women of reproductive potential were cut out of clinical trials for all new drugs starting in 1977. And let's talk about exactly what is meant by of reproductive potential. That means if there was any physical possibility for you to conceive, you were not allowed to take part in clinical trials. Even if you were on birth control, even if you were celibate, even if you were a lesbian in a monogamous relationship, even if you were straight and your husband had a vasectomy. This ban wasn't lifted until women's health activists in the late 1980s worked incredibly hard to convince lawmakers that this lack of data on how drugs affected women was killing women. And even then, it took till 1993 for Congress to pass a law requiring women be included in clinical research. But you know how much advancement in medical science happened between 1977 and 1993? A lot. Especially in cancer, heart disease, and psychiatric disorders, which are 3 of the diseases that most affect women. And we were left out of all of that research. Being left out of human clinical trials is bad enough, but it actually gets worse. Even in cell studies and animal studies, which are crucial for research and drug development, mostly male animals and cell lines are used. Why? If you ask researchers this question, they'll probably say that female animals' hormonal cycles make them more complicated to study. The fact that female mice have a 4-day hormone cycle, for example, means that different hormone levels at different times might affect the result of the experiment. And they'd potentially have to repeat the experiment on the mice at different times in their hormone cycle. Doing that would be more complicated and labor-intensive and therefore more expensive. They'd also tell you that you can't keep male and female animals together, obviously, unless you want a bunch of baby animals. And having 2 sets of separate cages and feeders and equipment for the 2 different population of animals is, again, more expensive. And if you ask them for one more reason, they might also even tell you that female rodents have smellier urine. Ew, scientists shouldn't have to deal with slightly smellier urine while they're doing science. So they just go with male animals. No pesky hormone fluctuations, only 1 set of equipment, less smelly urine. It just makes everything so much simpler. You've probably already spotted a problem with this flawless logic. Female humans, who are half the ultimate target population of this drug, also have hormone fluctuations. So while it might be slightly more complicated or expensive to study how this drug affects these animals at different times in their hormone cycle, isn't that vital information? But there's an even dumber reason that this is dumb. It turns out male rodents' hormones fluctuate too. It's not on a predictable 4-day cycle either. It turns out while female rodents coexist fine with other female rodents in a lab environment and have no change to their hormone cycles, male rodents, when housed together, battle it out for standing in a hierarchical social structure, which leads to spikes in testosterone and cortisol. In fact, male mice who end up on top of that social structure wind up having 5 times the testosterone that they had at the beginning. But apparently, no one is worried about those fluctuating hormone levels affecting the results of the experiment. Hormone fluctuations are apparently only a problem if the person or animal doing the fluctuating is female. And I'm pretty sure that's the definition of sexism. So because of this sexist bias that female animals are, quote, too hormonal to neatly fit into an experimental design, male animals are used 6 times more often in clinical studies than females. And the same goes for cell studies. More research is done on exclusively male cell lines, with the same hormonal issue also being cited as the reason. And maybe a question you have right now is, who cares? You know, if we're testing a painkiller, that's going to work the same in a male rat or a female rat. It's going to work the same in a male human or a female human. But the sex of the test subjects in drug trials is actually really important. Most common human diseases show up differently in men and women, whether it's who gets the disease, what the symptoms are, or how bad it can get. The classic example is heart disease. We're told that the symptoms to watch out for with heart attacks are chest and arm pain. But in women, it's way more common to feel stomach pain, nausea, and lightheadedness. The differences in symptoms are so little known that women experiencing a heart attack will often get turned away from the ER when they're having a heart attack because the symptoms they're reporting do not match what the doctors have learned heart attacks look like, because that's what they look like in men. But researchers have also found sex differences in every tissue and organ system in the body on a cell level, which means it actually really matters whether we use male or female cells in research and drug development. After so long studying mostly male bodies and cells, our research and our knowledge about women's bodies is decades behind our knowledge about men's bodies. And look, I'm 36, and the idea of possibly dying of a heart attack feels pretty abstract to me right now, knock on wood. Seriously. The fact that drugs aren't tested on women and dosage doesn't take hormonal fluctuations into account, this shows up in our daily life way closer to home. Antidepressants like SSRIs become more or less effective depending on what point in the menstrual cycle a person is in. That's because the different levels of estrogen and other hormones that are flowing through your body in different amounts at different points in your cycle, these directly affect serotonin levels. For ovulating people who are taking SSRIs, this might mean that you're not getting the drug's intended effect for up to 2 weeks of your cycle. Some gynecologists and psychiatrists are actually treating premenstrual dysphoric disorder, PMDD, which is a severe form of PMS, by prescribing an SSRI antidepressant that you only take in the luteal phase of your cycle. The luteal phase is the part of your cycle between ovulation and the first day of your period, when changes in the balance of hormones can mean that you have way less serotonin than usual. And as it turns out, lots of common medications affect ovulating people differently at different times in their cycles, because hormones affect pretty much everything. But because these drugs aren't tested or studied in ovulating people, the dosing doesn't reflect that. This idea that it's just too complicated and hard to study female humans and female rats and female cells because of their hormones, it's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. What do you mean it's too hard to study half the people? You get that women are going to be taking this drug too, right? And we don't think it's worth a little bit of effort to see how that's gonna go? How many drugs do you think there are that could have solved problems for women, but were canceled early in their development because they didn't work on male cells or male rats or male humans? How much do we not know that we don't know? Okay, now that I'm all worked up, let's talk to my sister again. How does learning how many people are out there with dysmenorrhea, or the fact that we can't really answer that question very well, how does that make you feel?
It's a mix of relief, I think, and also sadness.
Why do you feel relieved?
Relieved in that we're not alone, that we're not the outliers, and that it's not super weird, and that there's just something wrong with us that will never be solved.
Right.
So it's nice not to feel alone, but sad because the number is potentially so high. And the fact that there's so many people that have felt alone for however many years that they've had their period and felt like there is nothing that can be done about it, and just being like, it is what it is, and I just have to be in pain at this time every month. And I don't think that is the case. I don't think periods are supposed to be that painful.
Yeah.
There's definitely something we can do about it.
Yeah, absolutely. There is something we can do about it. We can talk to each other about it. We can drag all this shitty data into the light and pass it around and yell loudly about how stupid it is that we don't have better information, that science has been pretty incurious about this very common experience. Because none of us has the full picture. No matter how much information you have, if you're not connecting the dots with other people, you're in the dark. Our data expert, Andrea Jones-Rooy, confirmed this with their own experience.
I have lived for a very long time. I've never had a conversation about periods until now. I am a person with a uterus who experiences dysmenorrhea myself. I know so little substantively about it that I wasn't even sure how you say dysmenorrhea. I wasn't sure if it was dysmenorrhea. It's something that up to 90% of people with uteruses experience, up to 30% experience it in such a debilitating way that they can't go about their daily lives on a monthly basis, maybe for days and days at a time, and we don't even know how to spell it.
Yeah.
You know, I can spell influenza, I can spell gastroenteritis, I can spell all kinds of things, not to brag, but I can't spell something that I personally look up every month. Every month I am in bed feeling horrible and I say, what's causing these? Why am I feeling so horrible? Why don't we know better treatments for this? Why don't we have any idea what's causing this? And I will be the first to say that every month when I get cramps, I am somehow still surprised at how painful it is and how debilitating it is. I used to have a heating pad that helped. And then I moved and I lost it. And so now every month I'm like, I'm in so much pain. I'm going to Google heating pads. And then I feel better and I don't buy it.
And you forget it.
And I forget. And then lo and behold, a month later, I'm like, why don't I have a heating pad? I still don't have a heating pad.
And part of it is that we're not talking, because if I was talking to my friend about it 2 weeks before I got my period, I'd be like, right, I need to buy a heating pad right now.
Right.
But because we just are encouraged to forget that it ever happened and pretend it's never going to happen again, then we are like suddenly shocked when we're in pain again.
And also, as someone who's been experiencing this for many decades in my life and reads about it and then promptly forgets about it every month, like a eternal sunshine of the spotless uterus situation that I'm running, I would watch that movie. Literally, that's my main thought now that I can uncover my amnesia around it. It's like, how is the science not better? I have medicine for everything, right? It's like, yes, cancer, ALS, autoimmune, like there's serious stuff that we are still figuring out and fine. But this...
You know what? The cancer researchers wouldn't have to take a couple days off every month to deal with their period pain if we could figure that one out.
Yeah.
I don't take a single conversation I have about cramps for granted. Each one can feel really small when I think about all the information we're missing and how far we have to go. But every conversation gets us a little bit closer. One less person feels alone in their pain. One more person knows why their doctor doesn't have answers for them. And I'm especially not taking for granted that I have a literal sister in this long slog towards answers. Thank you very much for talking with me about this. I feel like we kind of missed an opportunity with our cramps early on. The way that we were suffering alone was like not necessary. And it's nice to be able to talk to you about this now. Better late than never, right?
It is really nice. And I think you're making up for it tenfold.
Oh, thank you. Well, the further you move away, the closer we seem to get. You can't get further away from me right now. I guess this is as close as we'll ever be.
It's a weird way to look at it, but sure.
Oh no, did I ruin a nice moment? Okay.
I mean, that's on brand.
Rude. My sister and I have been continuing our conversation over on a Discord server that I set up. We've also invited some friends to join, and we've been having some really cool conversations. If you would like to join the conversation and talk to a bunch of people who have been dealing with their period pain and are looking for a diagnosis and for more information and for recommendations of what has helped, email me at crampedpodcast@gmail.com and I'll send you the invite link. Come hang. We talked a lot of shit today about how little quality research has been done on dysmenorrhea, and I stand by that. But next week, we're taking a field trip to a whole lab in Evanston, Illinois, devoted to researching cramps and period pain. And spoiler alert, I get deeply humbled. Cramped is hosted and created by me, Kate Helen Downey. Kelsey DiLanzo is our editorial producer. Sound design and mixing is by Kelly Kramarik at Maven Post Media. Our associate producer is Caitlin Sabater. Cramped's incredible theme song is written and performed by Faraday. Our podcast art was created by Nicholas Scheppard. This podcast is supported by the Simons Foundation's Science, Society, and Culture Initiative. Fiscal sponsorship for Cramped is provided by the Arkansas Podcast Collaborative. If you'd like to send Andrea Jones-Rooy your data emergencies, you can find them on Instagram at Jones-Rooy, spelled Jonesrooy. And you could listen to their podcast, Behind the Data with Andrea Jones-Rooy. If you want to know more about somatic movement and breath work, you can find my sister's work on Instagram at Move with Maeve. Maeve is spelled Maeve. Special thanks to Mia Lobel, Yvette Modenow, and Matthew Starr.
What's happening to your body? We don't know because we never really studied the female body.